Panelists ready? Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Arabelle Lieppold. I'm the Executive Director at the Society of Illustrators in New York, and we're very honored to be here. It's the first time for us being at the Bologna Children's Book Fair, where we are part of the original art exhibit that you see outside here on the walls. It's one of our most prestigious competitions each year, and we brought the top 50 pieces to Bologna Children's Book Fair. And we have the pleasure of having 3 artists that are in the show here today with us for a panel, What Makes an Illustrated Book an International Success? And I don't know if 50 minutes are enough to find an answer, but we surely find out. And it's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Guarnaccia, who will moderate this panel. Stephen is an illustrator and designer, professor emeritus at the New York Parsons School, and he's also a very dear and close friend of the Society of Illustrators. And I hope you enjoy the panel today. Thank you so much to Stephen, Cecilia, Victoria, Felicita, and enjoy the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Arabelle. And thank you all for coming. And we were waiting for you all to leave because we thought the next audience had to come in. And it's so cool that you are the next audience. So, and we're going to conduct this in English. But this is really a panel about international illustration. The only thing I might change about the title, I would probably cross out the word success, because and so that will make it a little easier to fill the 50 minutes, because I don't think anybody can answer that question. There is no formula. But what we will do is we will talk with these illustrators who have worked across cultures, across languages, and who live in different parts of the world, sometimes different than the part of the world that they came from. One of the things that they share, obviously, is children's books, a love for children's books, participation in the Bologna Book Fair, and in the Society of Illustrators show. You should know that the Society of Illustrators show, though it's the American Society of Illustrators, is an ever more international competition. I hate that word. You know, there's been so many prizes given in these 3 days. It's really about inclusivity, and that's actually going to be one of our themes. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of the panelists. Maybe while I'm introducing you, you can start showing your images. Would that work?
I think.
Okay, do you know where to go? Is there a tech person who can get us out of the first slide? Here we go. Okay. So, Felicita Sala. She is an award-winning illustrator and painter, self-taught. She's illustrated over 20 picture books, and of those 20, she's written 4 of them. Her book, She Made a Monster, and As Night Falls, were selected among the best 10 illustrated books by the New York Times. Her first authored book, Lunch at 10 Pomegranate Street, has been translated in over 20 languages. She's received various awards, and her work is inspired by folk art, Byzantine iconography, and the unexpectedness of children. She grew up between Italy and Australia, now lives in Rome with her family. I asked each of the artists to give me a little nugget of their illustration philosophy. Felicita says she likes to make, she works to make books that her inner child will like. Famously, Maurice Sendak, who was childless and yet spoke to millions of children, said that he made books for the child within. He never stopped being, that child never grew up, was still intact internally. She thinks all creative work needs to come from a deep and honest place that feels right, first of all, to the creator. So, yeah? Have you gone through your slides?
I'm just
Sorry.
I'm just showing some of my work. I think I overpacked the file of illustrations that I was supposed to send, so I'm just quickly going to show you. I don't need to comment on these, do I?
And perhaps when I'm giving your bio, you can click through your images.
You can just
the
have
images really are meant, this is a conversation, and hopefully you will be part of that conversation. So The goal is to introduce you to the artists, introduce you to their work as background, so you have a context of what their work is like and where it comes from, and then for us to talk about this very interesting, especially now in this time of the breaching of national borders, identity politics, shared international graphic languages. So all of these topics, I think, are fair game. We'll talk about them amongst ourselves, but then we would like to include you in the conversation.
I think I'm done. This is my
Cool,
last.
beautiful work. I mean,
This is it.
all of the people here make wonderful work.
Let's see, I'm done.
Okay, and you know, I do want to just one little anecdote. I first encountered Felicita's work. She is born in Australia?
Born in Rome.
Born in Rome, raised in Australia, lives back in Italy, but I found her book in a German doctor's office because my wife is German. We spend the summers in Berlin, and we have a bilingual daughter who discovered her book, which we all fell in love with. I immediately went on Amazon and bought it. So that internationality is part of what we're talking about. So now, Victoria Tentler-Krylov. Here we go. Victoria is a silver medalist for the Society of Illustrators Original Art exhibition for her book, I'm Gonna Paint, Ralph Fasanella, Artist of the People. Her work has been regularly in the Original Art Show, some of which you see out here. Her books have received star reviews, many honors. Her first author-illustrator book, Building Zaha, the story of Iraqi-British architect Zaha Hadid, came out in 2020 and has been translated into German, Korean, Simple Chinese, and Complex Chinese, excuse me, for distribution in Taiwan. She's working on books dedicated to introducing young readers to architecture, urbanism, and climate change. Her inspiration is fueled by urban landscapes, but also by fantasy, possibility, and imagination. She lives and works just outside of New York. She grew up in St. Petersburg and came to the US to study architecture and urban design at Cooper Union and Columbia University. After working as an architect for years, she became a children's book illustrator and author. She's also an editorial illustrator, working with media outlets, and her work has been on the cover of The New Yorker 4 times.
Thank you so much.
Are we ready to go? Yeah, great. Cecilia Ruiz is a Mexican author, illustrator, and graphic designer, but she's based in New York City. She's worked for the New York Times, Google, Hermes, Target, and she teaches design and illustration in New York at the School of Visual Arts in Queens College. She's published 2 adult illustrated books with Penguin Random House, The Book of Memory Gaps and The Book of Extraordinary Deaths. Both topics that we all look forward to. A Gift from Abuela, her first picture book, published by Candlewick, is a Junior Literary Guild Gold Standard selection. Her latest picture book is published by Enchanted Lion Books, based in Brooklyn, and it's called Mr. Fiorello's Head. Her work is anchored in traditional printmaking techniques, and her geometric, stamp-like style lends itself to simple, happy expressions, despite the fact that her most compelling works are those in which melancholy hides within the bold colors and shapes. She likes to create picture books that deal with universal, existential themes, appealing equally to children and adults. So actually, when we talk about work that transcends culture, we might also talk about transcending age groups. Great.
Thank you.
So, some years ago, I chaired a conference in New York at Parsons called Where the Wild Books Are with Etienne de la Serre. It was in response to a noted children's book specialist, Betsy Bird, reporting that many US publishers and librarians were opposed to buying or republishing picture books that were first published overseas. Bird said that American publishers rejected non-US works as culturally inscrutable, inappropriate for American audiences. A controversial opinion that seemed to stem the flow of imaginative, beautiful, and sometimes provocative work into the US. This attitude is still hovering over us. But one of the questions I want to ask our panelists is there still a concern about books being too European or too other, to go beyond, obviously, simply Europe? I heard yesterday, coming back on the bus from the fair going into the city, an editor for Penguin Random House, actually, maybe an editor you've worked with, who said that there were some books that Penguin Random House found too English. Never mind too European or too Asian or too Mediterranean, because, and somebody said, well, what does that mean? Well, they take place in a small village somewhere. But are we now in a moment where, through the immediacy of Instagram, we've erased borders and we all share one visual language? Do all books then translate across all cultures? You all have books that have been published in different languages. You come from different cultural origins. And so maybe that's my first question. How does the current climate, how do you exist as an artist in the current international climate, both in terms of, say, shared social media as one of the most prevalent ways of sharing your work with the world, and in a time where national borders are sometimes literally being put up by walls or being framed by war? I know that's a big question. So if you want to just, Cecilia, we can start with you.
Yes, those are a lot of questions in one. But in my experience, I mean, I published all my books mostly in the US initially. And I started with 2 books that were more adult books. And I never thought they were going to be published. I made these books as school projects. And then I met an editor at Penguin Random House. A School of Visual Arts.
So you came to America?
Yes. I came to America to do a master's in the School of Visual Arts. And those were my school projects. And then this editor told me, your books look very European. They look for a European market, but she wanted to publish them. So I think and it was a publishing house that was bringing books that maybe were a little out of the ordinary. It doesn't exist anymore, that imprint. But that's how it happened. So I've always had this thing. I've always heard your work looks like more European, or then I also have this thing where they are like, why don't you make your book look more Mexican? Because you're from Mexico, and we want that. And that's also actually something that had made my first picture book happen, which happens in Mexico, and I think that was the appeal, actually, for it to be published. So, I don't know if that says anything. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's so interesting to think about that here, surrounded by all the books. And this is my first Bologna, so I don't have anything to compare it to. But I imagine that maybe 10 years ago, the US books looked different from French books, or maybe more different than they do this year and the year before. Maybe, that's what I'm thinking. Because I don't think I could say like, this looks like a US book published by a US publisher versus this definitely looks like an Italian book or a Korean and so on. I think it's beautiful that the styles are transcending boundaries, and I think Instagram and social media is a big, big part of it. And I'm very grateful to Instagram for giving me access to a lot of names, a lot of people, a lot of like glances into the behind the scenes work process of illustrators that I would have never encountered, I would have never known about. So that's amazing. As far as my own work and my own sort of background, so I grew up in Russia, and so my visual style and my inspiration was shaped by like 1950s, 1960s, and 70s and 80s Soviet books. If anyone knows or can kind of picture what those look like, I mean, they're stunning, they're amazing, but they were also shaped by like a lot of limitations, right? Like printing limitations and so on, even censorship limitations. But you know, I think when you're a child, kind of absorbing something definitely kind of imprints on you. So I think that's why my style looks a little bit 50s and 60s sometimes. Not that I grew up in the 50s, but those are the books that kind of my family kept, and I was exposed to those a lot. Then there are more recent illustrators like Sasha, for example, who I'm sure a lot of you know. He's a Czech illustrator with an incredible use of white space and other like unbelievably ingenious just kind of illustration moves that he's done. And I'm really attracted to that as well because I think I kind of sense a kindred spirit. But to cut to the chase, I think most of my books deal with place, space, buildings, settings, architecture. And sometimes I wish that, that I could reach more people and tell stories about very specific projects and get other people from other countries interested in a New York project like the Highline, for example. I'm sure probably most of you know what it is, but if you're not from New York, you may not realize that an incredible park like the Highline, an elevated railroad, which was turned into a park, exists, and the fascinating story of how it came about. So that's an example of something that I think would be wonderful if more children learned about other projects and other buildings and shared ideas across borders. And hopefully things are going in that direction. So that's what I would say.
I think the main question I remember, Stephen, from your long list of questions is the one about what does it feel to be creating in today's world and maybe cultural climate. As for me, I think I speak for a lot of people because I talk about this a lot with other illustrators and authors from around, but mainly ones working in the United States. And like I feel like I'm a hybrid of two worlds, and which is the Australian and the Italian one. Australia is an Anglo-Saxon kind of cultural environment, but it's different from the US in certain ways. I think we look at, like as picture book makers, we look at the contemporary artistic trends coming from Europe with a lot of envy as picture book makers who work in the United States. I feel sometimes, and it's not because somebody tells me that I can't do certain things, because that very rarely happens at this point. Maybe it happened earlier on. But I kind of feel it in the air, like I'm not really supposed to do everything I want to do, even if nobody says it, okay? There's like a kind of inner censoring that happens connected to the largest state of affairs of especially the United States kind of cultural vibe. So I perhaps overthink about it, but when I look at books coming out of, say, Sweden, which is one of my favorite countries to look at the moment for picture book making,
both their older books and the current ones, I feel a lot of envy towards that freedom of telling stories that show, you know, naked bums, blood, you know, weird things happening, nonsense, and like a lot more than, say, in the United States, because I'm attracted to those type of stories. I want to be making those kind of stories. And I think that maybe at this point in my career, I could maybe pull it off with certain publishers in America, so I feel really lucky in that sense, but not everyone can, and the books that are being chosen, like 99% of the time, are books that are rather safe and that are kind of play along with this kind of main message of kindness and let's all be friends, and which is frankly boring to my child self and probably to a lot of children. Children like to see bums and have a giggle and look at naughty things, you know? Why deprive them of that? So I'm kind of like a champion for the naughty in children's books. And I don't know.
Felicita, I wanted to ask you, could you just tell us very briefly what you and I talked about outside? Because you said, you know, you work with American audiences, but you have never been to America.
No.
Can you
I'm
talk
guilty.
just very briefly, just the path that your first publishing experience took?
Yeah, so I started working in the United States thanks to my agent, Kirsten Hall, who kind of found me in the sea of the internet and said, I really like your work, and do you want me to be your agent? And I was like, yes. It was right at the beginning of my illustration career. I'd only done a few books. Well, I kind of started with the UK, with Walker Books. I did a small book, then a couple of books with Canada. And then through my agent, I started, opened the door with America. Actually, the very first book I did in the United States was like a prime example, more than the one we talked about, of this vast difference. So this book was born from a drawing I'd done in my sketchbook, like a scribble. And my agent said, you should do a book about like emotions and colors. And I had to imagine this kind of poetic, for example, I'd done a streak of purple, and then underneath it said, violet is a lullaby, orange is a scream or something. Like, it was very simple, and I didn't realize that wouldn't work in America. It was just too abstract. And the publisher said, let's get an American author to take this concept and make it into a marketable book. The whole book was me learning a lesson on American marketing, because every step of the way, the story was nice, I liked it. The way I illustrated was slowly kind of morphed into let's make it more this, more that. The font that was chosen, I had massive problems with. The title was changed. The title of the book was I Don't Draw, full stop. And I thought it was brilliant, because you look at this book and you think, why doesn't this boy draw? And then you find out that it's because he prefers to color in and scribble and express himself that way. But the title I think they wanted to change it to was I Like to Color. And I was so appalled at this choice that I wrote to the author. I said, you can't let them do this. This is horrible. They're spoiling the reason for the book, and it's such a boring title. I like to color, with the boy coloring on the cover. I was just I had my first breakdown working with America with this book. And then I managed to somehow, through very long, intricate essay form emails to everybody, convince them to keep the title I Don't Draw. So they met me halfway and said, okay, we'll call it I Don't Draw, I Color, exclamation mark. And so, a lot of those choices are not choices I would have made as a European, but it was a kind of humbling lesson in working together with other people and accepting that you're not God of your book. So that was, I don't know if I'm talking too much.
No, that's okay, but let me follow on that, because this idea of markets and the Society of Illustrators show, for instance, is a way for the U.S. to see U.S. illustrators, but the rest of the world. And there is a sense, and I think one of the reasons why the U.S. publishers are so nervous, it's not because we can't bear the sight of naked bottoms. It's because the market is so, put your own expletive before the word huge, that the goal becomes not to sell many different kinds of stories to many different niches, but to try to sell to the largest possible audience because you can make such a lot of money. There are exceptions. But my question to you all then, let's move from the market or the publisher to the reader. Are you making your books, and you've kind of said this in some of your comments, but are you making these books, to what degree do you internalize the reader? In other words, the eventual audience. Not necessarily the person who's going to pay you your advance, but the person who's going to be reading the book. Are you writing the book for yourself, or do you have in mind some ideal reader external to yourself, say? Go ahead.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the book that's here in the Society of Illustrators show is my book, I'm Gonna Paint, the story of Ralph Fasanella, who is a painter, an Italian-American painter and labor activist who was born on the Lower East Side in New York City in the 20s, and then went in an immigrant family that struggled, and so he didn't get to really go to school, he didn't really get to go to art school, he taught himself everything, and then he became a labor activist, and sort of the book talks about the path of his life. I mean, in general, I definitely always think about how the book is going to come across to the reader, and you have to. If you're not asking yourself that, I think you're gonna probably miss a lot of marks because the book won't resonate. Is this one? Yeah, this one is good. So that's the central question. How is the reader going to enjoy and understand the book, and how much will the book stay in the child's brain that they will want to come back to it again, and again? In I'm Gonna Paint, I wanted the central message of the story to be, to kind of go beyond the specific retelling of Ralph's life. It's a nonfiction story, so it's a real life story of what happened with him and his career and the path of his life. But there's a very interesting theme where he taught himself everything. He initially taught himself to read, then he taught himself to paint. And so I really focused at every point of the book on kind of trying to celebrate the message of look how amazing it is to believe in the fact that you can learn anything, and if you don't have the resources or the opportunity to get some kind of training, you can actually teach yourself to do that thing. And learning to read on his own, learning to paint on his own is amazing, and I think that's the central story of that particular book and all of my other books. So I would say basically, yeah, in a nutshell, the reader is the one that really matters in the end. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for me, it's a little different. I try not to think about who the book is for right away, because otherwise I get stuck trying to make it fit. So I try not to think and just try to say what I'm trying to say without thinking who is going to be the audience. But at some point, I do have to think about that, because ultimately the goal is to sell the book, and to sell the book, it needs to have a clear audience, even if it's a wider range. So maybe at some point in the process, I share this thing with my picture book friends, that maybe have a better eye for what's for kids, because I tend to think more adult, and to think, I think I make books for adults, and then I try to mask them as for children. But then I can show it to my friends, and then I have friends who might tell me, you know what, maybe that's too adult, too adult-like, or the language might be too sophisticated, you know. So try to say it more for a kid. So that's how at that point, maybe I start tweaking things so it fits more of either children or young adult or whatever.
Thank you. I want to follow that with, you've all lived in different countries. Has that informed your work? I mean, Victoria, you spoke specifically about the Russian kids' books from the mid-20th century that you grew up with. But has your artistic journey been affected by where you come from, but also by your need to adapt to a new or different culture and language? Felicita, do you want to take a stab at that?
Okay, let me. You mean if my artistic career has been influenced by the two countries in any way?
Yeah, I guess, you know, to what degree has being from somewhere else,
Yeah.
or having been in different places, what do you bring from that? The books you read as a child, or
Yeah.
the fact that you're bilingual, or the fact that you know, grew up in Mexico but do all of your career in America, or you know, just
Yeah.
how does any of that mix affect what you do or think?
I don't know, it's hard to say because I think we're all very kind of complex humans, and we all, even if you come from one small town and you've never moved from there, like just life experience brings in various people and books and influences anyway, and I suppose it's created in me, living between two countries, a sort of like, at the same time, a kind of split in identity and then an integration of the two. So I'm very much interested in things and people and books that show a hybrid nature, or that talk about travel or movement or things like that. But I was very influenced by, as an Italian, like most Italians growing up in the 80s, but even before, we are very influenced by the stories of Gianni Rodari, who's the master of kind of like, I suppose, absurdity and language play and like really wondrous imagination. And that's an underlying current, I think, in my philosophy of making children's books. And then being introduced to the Australian, and that is largely a UK tradition, then I discovered the work of Roald Dahl, who is one of my favorite people in this world of bookmaking, in terms of the importance of stories and the importance of like the funny, and like what I learned from Roald Dahl, and it's actually what this ties back to the question you asked before about the audience that you write for, is I've thought a lot over these years about the audience, and I don't know, it's like, for me, making a book is like when you give a gift to someone and you get it right, and that person is really happy about that gift, and he's like, you understand me, you know? When somebody gives you a gift and it's the wrong gift and you feel disappointed, not because it's a crappy gift, but because you feel that you are not understood by the person that is supposed to know you and love you. And the greatest satisfaction I get in my career is when I get messages from people saying, show me a video of their child interacting with one of my books, or using it to cook with, because I've done recipe books, or saying, you know, he falls asleep with it, he wants it read every night. And that to me is like a greater compliment than any award I could possibly receive. And so Roald Dahl has this famous interview, and I always talk about it, and I think I watch it once a year just to remember, because I'm such a fan of this interview. he did this interview with the BBC outside his little writing hut, and he says, you know, children are the harshest critics, and they will pick up a book and, like, if they don't like it, they won't want to read it again. But if they do, they'll want it read every single night for, like, an infinity of time. Whereas we can accept mediocre books, read them, put them away, pass on to the next one. Writing for children is extremely important. So in that sense, that audience is extremely important to me. And it's important that I understand the audience that I'm working with and I value them. And even though all children are different and they have different interests, I mean, I'm writing from my small perspective of things that I like and that appeal, again, to the child's self. And again, Roald Dahl said, to work with books for children, you have to be yourself like an overgrown kid, you know? And that's, I think, the books that appeal to me, because there are many different types of books. There are books that are purely poetic, purely artistic. They are very kind of adult-oriented that children might appreciate. But the books that I like increasingly are ones that tell stories that kids like and that understand how kids' minds work. But when I make these books, I'm not thinking about the audience at all. And I think it's very important to not focus too much on the audience, because then your attention goes outside of the creative space. And so I like to just think of what is funny to me, what is nice to me as a child inside with the complexity of an adult. And then that somehow works better in the end when the children read it, it kind of works. So sorry, I answered both questions in one, sorry.
I mean, I think, kind of picking up on what you were saying, I really think, I'm going to focus on illustration and art for kids for a minute. I think children's illustration is probably the most important genre of art that exists, as far as I'm concerned. Because those images, they kind of imprint themselves on the brain, right? And they stay with you forever, really. And they shape you, they shape early memories. I don't know if there's anything else that could be as much responsibility as that, right? They are imprinting. So for me, I mentioned a little bit my own influences and those mid-century Soviet books. I mean, growing up in Russia in the 70s was a pretty insular experience, was the Iron Curtain, right? The country was closed. So those were the only things I saw. But then coming here to the US, I think things that resonated with me in the West that I started to see were kind of, you know, accordingly similar to those early things that I liked. And so that means Roger Devoisian, like mid-century New Yorker covers, again, Miroslav Šašek, the mid-century Czech illustrator that I mentioned before. So all the things that kind of pick up on each other and develop and so on. And so I think just like any other illustrator, my work right now is developing. It will always be changing. I'm very aware of the fact that it needs to always change. It could never stop and become stagnant. It's important to grow, but it's still a product of all the influences that I've had so far and the influences that I'm still experiencing to this day. And I think everybody really, even if you don't think about it a whole lot or if you don't realize it, probably works the same way for you.
Thank you. Cecilia.
Yes.
We're going to have Cecilia's response, and then I'd love to open the conversation to the audience.
Great. So to the question of how
Where you came
where
from.
I came from influenced my work, I find it very interesting because I grew up in Mexico City. I was born and raised there, and I moved to the US until I was an adult to go to grad school. And I really never thought about how that affects my work, right? And in fact, when I got to New York, until that moment, I realized that I was Mexican, you know, in a way. And that was a thing. That was a thing. So I almost had to reflect on it more than I had ever done in my life, because it seemed interesting to people. And it seemed like people wanted that to be part of my work, in a way. so when I started working, I never want to work about Mexican things. That was not part of what I wanted to be exploring. But in a way, that's what people seem to want me to do. So there was a part of me. And then, of course, I started thinking about it. And I was like, I never thought about how the place where I'm from translates into my work. I had never really thought about it. So I actually started looking back at my Mexican roots and trying to see how that affected my work. So it's changed. Moving to a different place has changed the way I feel about the place I am from. And it's allowed me to see and appreciate things where I am from that I had never noticed, because when you're immersed in a place, you start not noticing certain things about the place where you live in, and then you need distance to see them. So that's been really fascinating, because it's made me reconnect with some part of my Mexican identity that I didn't know. But at the same time, I feel like, well, I don't necessarily want to be talking about that, or I don't necessarily want to be working around that all the time.
But in a sense, I think one thing that I feel like you've each said is that whether you want to or not, you almost can't avoid it. It's part of you.
Yeah.
So we're going to open this to the audience. I do think one tip for those of you who want to make books that are international successes is, if you live someplace and you haven't lived someplace else yet, move. Any questions?
Hi, and thank you for, well, all the different perspectives you've given. I have a question for all three. I don't really... Yes, very briefly. I have the impression, I'm a very young illustrator and other too, and I have the impression that now when you look into social media, for example, when you get into Instagram, that everybody kinds of draw in the same manner. And I want to ask if you have this impression too, like everybody is having the same trend when it comes to, for example, developing nature. I must think now of Iraville. I don't know if you know her. She's a German illustrator who draws many nature topics, especially autumnal one. And now I have the feeling like every single illustrator kinds of draw trees in the same manner, with the same color palette, etc.
So the question is, how does social media, does it really affect the way that we all draw?
I think, I mean, I know exactly what you mean. Oh, okay. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I see those trends, and it's kind of bizarre and unsettling. So I try to avoid it. I try to not look at it so much, because first I start feeling envy and jealousy, and then I'm like, I should be doing more of that. You know, I want my work to look like that. And I know that's not a good place for me to go down that rabbit hole. So I've been trying to avoid that, and I've been trying to unfollow a lot of people that I just don't need to see.
That's it's so interesting. I could talk about this for an hour, but I'm not going to. Keep it very short. Yeah, it's absolutely true. Absolutely true what you're saying. I think it's 5 minutes left. Okay. It's dangerous to be doing that, right? It is, like, and I don't want to overemphasize it, but ultimately for those of you that are young illustrators just starting out, I am sure you're thinking about how to stand out from the sea of other illustrators, right? And you are going to stand out if your style is unique and doesn't look like anybody else's style. And to arrive at that, You need to be original, and I think there's a beauty in looking at other people's work. It's super important to be doing that, but there's a fine line between being influenced and being influenced. So that's what I would say.
Maybe we can do another question, because I feel the same.
And the only thing I want to say is it's always been so. That's why Victoria could talk about 1950s Russian style, because style is a tendency that happens at a moment. Styles pass. The only thing that's really changed is the means of disseminating it, because it happens so much faster because of the reach of social media, I would say.
Cheers. I was wondering how much you take in account, or how much have you been looking at how the markets work, what is in trend, like in a more commercial mindset, you know, to see if things if you will adapt your work to that, or you will go like completely free.
So to what degree do you make work that perhaps follows the market?
Not much at all. Because like I said before, when I'm creating, I create for my inner child, and my inner child doesn't care at all about the market. And I think that the more you create from an honest place, the better the work is going to be. And then probably that also translates into a successful book, if it comes from an honest place. If you're creating based on market trends, it's going to look like a lot of other things. You're going to get a lot of sameness, and it's just going to be boring, and it's going to like maybe be successful at the beginning for some reason, get a bit of hype, but then it's just certainly not going to become a classic through the years. That's what I think.
I think about that in only one case, and that case is when I think I have a good idea for a book that I'm going to write. I do find that I need to think about whether or not that book will resonate with publishers, whether or not a publisher will be interested in it, and whether or not that book is going to grow and get an audience. So yes, I absolutely do think about that when I develop those ideas. And I try, of course, not to, I still kind of like focus on ideas that are interesting to me, but I am aware of that. But that's the only instance. The way I draw, the way I paint or write has nothing to do with the market.
I feel the same, especially because, I don't know, but I just have a few ideas, you know, like I might get a few ideas for books. So I'm gonna follow those without overthinking if they can fit. However, I think there are a few things that maybe one can think about in terms of cost. Maybe don't come up with the craziest production, complicated idea that everyone is gonna say, no, that's too expensive to make. And maybe make a book that maybe you have those crazy ideas, but that there could be a version of it that is more doable, and that you're flexible and you're willing to compromise on certain things so it can be sold.
Thank you. What an incredibly articulate panel. And I would love to speak with all of you about like 12 other topics, different topics. We could just keep coming up with topics. If you will stay here, we can just be the next panel and the next panel and the next panel. I'll talk to Ivan. I think we can. Thank you very much for coming, for filling this room, and look forward to seeing you around the fair. You guys.